Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive on a 2001 report from the UN Population Division.
Sounds interesting.
It is, it's all about replacement migration and tackles some big questions about population decline, especially in developed countries.
Yeah, it's a pretty important topic these
For
days.
sure, and since it's coming from the UN, it definitely carries some weight.
Absolutely. The UN Population Division, I mean, they're not just some random think tank.
Right.
They are very highly regarded. And a lot of people, well, policymakers around the world often look to them to shape policy.
Yeah.
So when they put out a report like this, people pay attention.
Yeah, for sure. In this report, it really doesn't hold back. I mean, it straight up predicts population decline
Oh, wow.
over the next 50 years in Japan.
Yeah.
And in almost all European countries.
Really?
Yeah, just to give you like a sense of the scale here, Italy's population, it's projected to like drop from 57 million to 41 million
Wow.
by 2050.
Yeah, those numbers are definitely attention grabbing. And, to really understand them, we need to look at what's actually driving these projections.
Right.
And the report, it points to below replacement fertility rates,
Okay.
which basically means women are having, on average, fewer than 2.1 children.
Okay.
That's kind of the magic number to keep the population stable
Gotcha.
without needing migration.
Okay, so fewer babies, but then
Mhm.
at the same time, people are living longer.
Right.
So I can see how that would create like some demographic challenges.
Exactly. And the report, it actually gets into the nitty-gritty of those challenges by analyzing something called the potential support ratio,
Okay.
PSR for short.
Okay.
And it's basically a way to measure like the balance between the people who are working age
What?
and then those age 65 and older.
So it's like how many workers there are to support retirees.
Exactly. Like if you have, let's say, 100 people of working age, for every 50 people who are over 65,
Yeah.
that gives you a PSR of 2. And so the lower the PSR, the more pressure it puts on those working age people to support the elderly.
Oh, that makes sense. So what's happening then to the PSR in these countries that are facing population decline?
Well, the report predicts that it's going to drop significantly,
Oh.
which could put a real strain on their economies and,
Sure.
all those social safety nets.
Yeah.
And the report even suggests that, just increasing fertility rates, it might not be enough to
Mhm.
turn things around quickly.
Okay, and that's where this idea of replacement migration comes into play.
Exactly. And the report, it really goes deep into 5 different migration scenarios, each with like a very specific goal.
Okay, I think I'm already feeling a little lost in the numbers, so
Yeah.
let's break those scenarios down.
Sure. So scenario I, that basically just follows the UN's standard projections, which, already factor in some level of migration.
Oh yeah.
Scenario 2 is a little different. It's more hypothetical.
Yeah.
Like imagine if there was 0 migration after 1995. Yeah, just to give us a baseline.
Okay.
It lets us see the impact of migration by, comparing it to that no migration scenario.
Oh, so it's kind of like a control group.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, scenario 3 is where things start to get a little more interesting.
Okay.
So this scenario calculates like how much migration you would need to keep a country's total population at its peak level.
So no decline at all.
No decline allowed.
I'm guessing that would require like a lot of people.
It does. For instance, under this scenario, Italy would need 12.6 million migrants to maintain its population,
Wow.
compared to, a projected 0.3 million under the standard projections that we talked about in scenario A.
That's a huge difference.
Yeah, it is.
So what are the other scenarios?
Right. So scenario 4, this one's focused on the working age population.
Okay.
And it's figuring out how much migration would be needed to keep that part of the population at its peak level.
So not about preventing like overall population decline, but
Yeah.
making sure there are enough people to, be in the workforce.
You got it. And then finally, we have scenario V, which aims to keep that PSR, remember the balance between workers and retirees, stable at its 1995 level.
Okay.
So 5 very different approaches, each with its own implications.
For sure. And before we dive deeper into those, I think it's important to remember where this report is coming from,
Yeah.
the UN Population Division.
Right. And that does add, a certain level of legitimacy to their findings.
Yeah.
Because it's not just like hypothetical numbers, they're based on some pretty rigorous data analysis and modeling from,
Right.
a well-respected global institution.
Yeah, I imagine that makes policymakers and researchers worldwide take these scenarios pretty seriously.
Oh, yeah.
But I have to wonder, with such dramatic projections, especially for, something like Scenario V, where like millions of migrants would be needed, how realistic are these scenarios?
That's a good point. And the report does acknowledge that these scenarios, they're really just exploring possibilities. They don't actually try to predict what will happen.
Right.
It's more about, understanding the potential impacts of different levels of migration
Okay.
and how they could interact with these larger population trends.
So they're kind of like laying out the playing field.
Exactly.
But it's up to each country to decide how they want to play the game.
Yeah, and that's where things get even more complex because we're not just talking about numbers on a spreadsheet. We're
Right.
talking about people, cultures, societies.
Yeah, and all the social and political stuff that goes along with large-scale migration.
Exactly. But before we get into all of that, let's maybe explore these scenarios a bit more because there are some fascinating data points in there about, potential migration patterns in the coming decades.
So we're talking about like millions of migrants,
And rounding.
right? Potentially reshaping these countries.
It is. Yeah, it really highlights just how big of a challenge these countries are facing. But, it is important to remember that these scenarios, especially the ones with like really high levels of migration, they come with, a lot of complexities that the report itself doesn't really dig into.
Yeah, you're talking about like the social and political stuff, right?
Exactly. Like integrating all those people from different cultures.
Yeah.
The report is really focused on the numbers.
Right.
But, those numbers are people with their own, languages, customs, beliefs, ways of life.
Yeah.
And integrating those differences into existing societies, well, it's not exactly a simple thing.
No, I can imagine that could create some tension. It's not just about like finding them homes and jobs.
Right.
It's like,
Right.
how do you actually build a society where everyone feels like they belong?
Absolutely. And that takes, a really thoughtful approach, not just from like the government side, but, from society as a whole. Addressing inequalities, promoting understanding between cultures, creating opportunities, for everyone to participate.
So it sounds like the report scenarios, while helpful, I guess, for understand the demographic side,
Yeah.
they don't really give us the whole picture.
Right. It's like they're saying, hey, here's the puzzle. Now you got to figure out how to put it together.
Right.
And that's where things get messy, complicated. Because there's no, one-size-fits-all answer. Each country has to figure it out in its own way based on, their history, culture.
It makes you wonder, like, how would these scenarios be received in these countries facing population decline? I mean, the idea of like mass migration, I'm sure that would spark some strong reactions.
It's definitely, it's a sensitive topic and very political. Some people, I'm sure, would see it as a threat to their national identity, their culture, while others, they might see it as like an economic necessity or, maybe even like a moral obligation.
It seems like the UN, by presenting all these scenarios but not really saying which one is best, it's almost like they're trying to start a conversation more than dictate like a solution.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And it goes back to, the UN Population Division's role. They're seen as a credible source. So by putting this information out there, they're kind of encouraging governments, researchers, and really just society to like think about these tough issues.
So it's not this is what you should do. It's more like here's what could happen, so let's talk about it.
Right. And I think that's, a pretty responsible way to handle it, especially with such a touchy subject. They're providing the information, the framework, but then it's up to, individual countries and societies to make their own choices.
All this just makes me think about like the credibility of this report and, the UN Population Division's role in all of this. They seem to be like walking a fine line
Yeah.
between presenting, objective data and then at the same time, sparking all this debate.
It's a tough balance, but I think they've done a pretty good job with it. They've presented the data in a way that's pretty easy to understand, but they're also, open about the limitations and all the stuff that goes beyond just the numbers.
It's almost like they're saying, okay, trust the data, but don't just, blindly accept it.
Right.
Like, think for yourself, consider everything, and let's have a real conversation.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important message, especially these days where there's so much information out there, it's hard to tell what's real and what's not. So when it comes to, complex stuff like migration and demographics, it's super important to really think critically about the data and to, try to see all sides of the story.
So we've established the UN report. It's a good starting point,
Yeah.
but it's just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
So let's talk about some of those other pieces, like the economic stuff,
Yeah.
social factors, all those things that actually, influence where people decide to move.
Right. Because migration, it's not just about demographics. It's about, people making choices based on their own, circumstances, their hopes for the future, things like job opportunities, political stability, freedom. All of those things play a role in where people choose to live and work.
It really does feel like a huge web of all these different things, demographics, economics, politics, social values, all kind of intertwined in shaping these migration patterns.
It is. And the report, even though it's mainly focused on the demographics, it does hint at some of those bigger issues.
Yeah.
For example, it even says, even if countries manage to attract enough migrants, enough to stabilize their population or keep those support ratios up, there's no guarantee that those new folks will keep having kids at the same rate.
Oh, interesting. So they might adopt the host country's lower fertility rates?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
and that just adds, another layer of complexity to these scenarios.
Yeah.
It suggests that migration, maybe it's a band-aid solution for population decline in the short term.
Mm.
But it doesn't mean it's going to fix everything in the long run. Not unless you get to the root cause, the reasons why people aren't having as many kids.
This whole thing, it really makes you realize how much planning goes into, trying to manage these big population shifts.
Absolutely. It's a huge undertaking. And I think the UN report does a good job of highlighting some of the big things to consider.
Yeah.
But it also really shows us how much we still don't know.
What do you mean? What are some of the things that are still up in the air when it comes to predicting these trends?
Well, I mean, trying to predict future fertility rates, that's always tricky.
Yeah.
So many things affect it. Social things, economic things, cultural things, all changing over time. And the report even acknowledges this, It basically says, hey, these are just projections based on what we know now.
Yeah.
Who knows what the future holds?
So it's the data is good. It's helpful for thinking about this stuff, but we can't take it as fact.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. We have to be, a little cautious.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to keep doing research, keep gathering data.
Right.
Try to really understand how all these different pieces fit together.
This really makes me think about the UN Population Division and the work they do. It's super important because by putting out these projections, they're not just giving us data. They're giving us a starting point for all these conversations and discussions that we need to be having.
Exactly, because we're not just talking about numbers here. We're talking about people's lives, the future of whole societies, and how we deal with some of these really big challenges. It's been great to dive into this report with you, talk about all the possibilities.
Yeah. It's been a fascinating deep dive for sure. Thinking about replacement migration and all these different factors, what really sticks out to you? What's the biggest takeaway?
For me, it's really just remembering that demographics, they're always changing. It's not set in stone. But they definitely have an impact on, what our societies look like, the challenges we face. And, migration, it can be a really important tool, to deal with some of these population shifts. But it's not a magic solution. You have to think it through, plan it out, and really focus on creating societies that are, inclusive and where everyone feels welcome.
Well said. I think that's a perfect way to wrap things up. This conversation about demographics and migration in the future, it's definitely not over. But if we have the data, if we have these insights, and we're willing to really talk to each other, and listen, I think we can figure out a way forward, a way to create a future that's better for everyone. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And be sure to check out the show notes for a link to the UN report if you want to learn more. And we'll see you next time. Keep on exploring.